Thank you all. Thank you for welcoming me tonight. I really look forward to spending some time with you and telling you a little bit about my story and Tim's story. I just want to start by saying that if you were to see Tim today, and you could find him potentially on the streets of San Francisco, you might turn the other way. You might actually cross the street to avoid him. Tim is about 6.5 feet tall. He's African American. He's got curly wild hair that's most of the time out to here somewhere. And he's not very clean living on the street. And so oftentimes people who see somebody who looks like Tim, and there are literally hundreds of people on the streets of San Francisco who look like Tim, they tend to walk in another direction. I often say that, Tim, because of his size and his appearance, isn't even able to do well at panhandling. And so Tim frequently, like many young men with schizophrenia who are just trying to get by in life, does things that get him in trouble and does things that get him sent, frankly, to jail. One of the things that Tim does is, because he can't panhandle, he'll go sometimes car to car and see which doors are unlocked. And if a door's unlocked in a car, he'll look and see if there's a little bit of change in the car, and he'll take that little bit of change. But because he's 6.5 feet tall, he gets caught. People notice that he's doing that. He doesn't think he walks and casts such a big shadow. But the fact of the matter is, those of us who are not quite that size and don't appear quite that way understand that Tim and many people like Tim do cast that kind of a shadow. Now, I'll be honest with you. I one time remember coming out of my home in Lake Worth, and my car was parked out on the street, and somebody had come into my car and had gone into the little glove box and had found a few cents that was in there. And I remember feeling quite violated by that. And I really felt quite uncomfortable and quite insecure after that. So I understand how the effects of Tim's actions affect other people. But I also understand something else, and it's what I want to talk about this evening. It is that Tim's actions are not all actions that Tim takes by choice, at least not just his own choice. They're actions that he takes as a result of choices that we've made for Tim as a matter of public policy over the course of the last 30 years. Tim just turned 30 years old in March, on March 18th, as a matter of fact. And Tim began to show signs of schizophrenia when he was 5 years old, about 25 years ago. Now, a lot of people think that schizophrenia and a lot of conditions, serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, begin in a young adulthood. And we're told they most frequently begin in young adulthood. But what many people don't know is that 1/2 of all mental illnesses manifest by the age of 14. So mental illnesses, even serious mental illnesses, are frequently diseases of childhood. The problem is we don't recognize them as diseases of childhood. What we see are just basically odd or unusual behaviors that may be a little atypical and need to be brought rapidly under control, are in fact the early warning signs of serious mental illnesses. But we ignore them and think, well, as in the case of Tim, as his teachers once said, well, if he would only just follow the rules, he'll be fine. And I would say, well, Tim has schizophrenia and couldn't follow the rules that you needed him to follow, so he wasn't going to be fine as a result of that. But people seem to think that he could just pull himself out of this, if only he'd try. It would be akin to telling a child with childhood onset leukemia, that they could just, reduce that fever. They could just eliminate the pain. They could just pull themselves out of that, if only they would try. Well, we know better with childhood leukemia, just as with adults. We know better with cancer. We know better with heart disease. We know better with diabetes. Well, with children with mental illnesses, and even adults now, as Tim is with mental illnesses, believe it or not, we don't know better these days. We tend still to think of these things as simply behavioral conditions. We even make the mistake of calling them behavioral health conditions sometimes to make them feel a little better for people. But because we think of them as simply behavioral conditions, we then think of them as just bad behavior. And in their early stages, If it's just bad behavior, then of course all they need is a little discipline. All they need is a little consequences, and they will be able to straighten themselves out. That worked for me when I was a kid. If I had a little bit of discipline, if I knew I was going to have some consequences, I'd be able to follow the straight and narrow. I'd be able to straighten myself out. But then again, I didn't have schizophrenia. And I often tell groups that I'm talking to that the reason I'm here talking to you right now, and Tim is not here talking to you right now, is not that I went to college and Tim didn't. It's not that I was raised by biological parents and Tim was raised by adoptive parents. It's not that I'm white, he's black. It's not that I'm 5 feet 9 inches tall and he's 6.5 feet tall. No, the reason that I'm here and he's on the streets of San Francisco is he's got schizophrenia and I don't. And believe me, if that was the one thing that was different between Tim and me, he might be the one here talking about the book he'd written about his father and the circumstances affecting his father, and I might be the one out on the streets of San Francisco homeless, if I were still alive. Because Tim and I have the same life expectancy, and relatively few people with schizophrenia make it to the age of 60. And so why that is has a lot to do with public policy. And that's why the book Losing Tim is not just about Tim's story. It's about my story with Tim because, as you heard, I was a state legislator. I was elected to the Connecticut General Assembly back in 1978, okay? More than 35 years ago, I entered public office. And when I got into the General Assembly, I like to tell this story to people, and I've told it earlier today too. People said to me, okay, you've gotten onto the Appropriations Committee. The chair people called me in and said, well, which subcommittees would you like to be on? And I said, well, I've just gotten out of school. I'm a relatively young guy, so I think I know something about education, so I'd like to be on the Education Subcommittee. And I've been doing volunteer work, playing my accordion at nursing homes for senior citizens. And the Human Services Subcommittee deals with nursing homes and deals with issues affecting elderly people, so I'd like to be on the Human Services Committee as well. And for my third subcommittee, I'd like to be on the Regulated Activities Subcommittee because I'm an anti-nuclear power activist. I'm a pro-solar, pro-energy conservation person, and the way to get more money into our state budget for alternatives to nuclear energy is through that Regulated Activities Subcommittee, so please put me on that one too. Those chairpeople of the Appropriations Committee stared at me with straight faces and said, you're going to do health. I said, I don't want to do health. And they said, neither does anybody else. So you're going to do health. And so at 25 years old, with a bachelor's degree in philosophy, I was now the go-to person in the Connecticut State Legislature for all matters related to health, mental health, developmental disabilities, substance use disorders, and Veterans Affairs, because we had no place else to put those. So now I'm the expert and had to learn on the job. What did I know about mental health at that time? I knew about what could fit in a thimble. Connecticut Valley Hospital was one of our large state psychiatric hospitals. It was in my hometown of Middletown, but it was not actually in my home district. I had only been there one time in my life to play my accordion for patients at that particular program, that particular facility, at a holiday party they were having. That's what I knew about mental health at the time when I got into the legislature working on those issues. You want to know something? I wasn't terribly unusual. I had to learn on the job, and I spent a lot of time going to meetings around the country to learn about health issues. And I worked with a lot of colleagues from around the country, and one of my friends was a state legislator from Michigan. And at one point, we were sitting there in Washington, D.C., in front of a researcher, and we were actually rehearsing this researcher who was needing to make health services research available to public officials because they wanted those of us in state government to be better informed in the decisions we were making in the 1980s. And so we were sitting there, and this researcher went through a long discussion, 45 minutes of a rehearsal, of this presentation he was going to do. And at the end of the presentation, my colleague from Michigan looked at the guy and said, you need to understand, you've got to make this simpler. I need to be able to explain this to a plumber. And the researcher said, okay, I understand what you're saying to me. What you're saying is when you get back into your districts, You've got to be able to explain this stuff to people from all walks of life. And he said, no, you don't understand what I'm saying. The chairperson of my public health committee is a plumber. I've got to be able to explain this to a plumber. And so that's essentially the credentials that we all had moving into public office. So is it any wonder that we made policy mistakes in the 1980s, policy mistakes that policymakers today continue to make? Back, I was doing the best I could working on those mental health budgets, and I was a big proponent of moving people from the state psychiatric hospitals, closing those if we could, and moving people back into communities, because we felt nearly anything we did in the community would be better than those custodial care institutions that we were trying to close at that time. Well, as it turns out, sometimes anything you do isn't better, because what we ultimately ended up doing is moving those people from one form of custodial care institution to another form of custodial care institution. Today we call them jails and prisons. And that's where people like my son Tim go, and that's where people like my son Tim spend the greater part of their adult lives getting treated for their mental health conditions and their serious mental illnesses. It's not real treatment. It's the same kind of horrifying, behind locked door custodial care that we were giving to the generation in the 1980s. So where did we make our biggest mistake? Well, we made it in this respect. We made it because we understood who it was who was coming out of those state hospitals when we started closing the doors and beginning to think about building systems of community care. The people who were coming out of those state hospitals looked a lot like you and me. The people who were going into those state hospitals looked a lot like my son 15 years ago. We were sending kids and teenagers into those systems, and when they were coming out as adults. And what we didn't understand was, when we started building a community system of care, that we needed to start with our children. Remember, 50% of serious mental illnesses begin by the age of 14. We needed to start with our children, do early identification, early intervention, integrated services, and build a system that would keep our kids in school. We needed to change our education system to accommodate these children who were coming into it, because if we didn't do that, it wasn't going to make too much difference what we did on the adult side, because by then we were going to have lost them. Unfortunately, this played out directly in my life. 5 years later, Tim came along, age of 7 weeks, cutest imaginable kid. In fact, that cutest imaginable kid, whose picture is on the front page of the book, he was just 5 years old at that time. Remember I told you he's 6.5 feet tall? He was a big kid then too. He was like a 10-year-old, but he was 5 years old at that time and absolutely adorable. Nobody crossed the street to avoid Tim in those days. I used to bring him to the state capitol with me, and my colleagues would crowd round to try to hold Tim and play with Tim, because he was just so adorable, just so friendly, just such a good little kid. But when he got to school, his kindergarten teachers began to notice that there was something a little different about Tim from the other kids. Tim, first of all, had a lot of trouble paying attention. And Tim had a lot of difficulty forming friendships. And once in a while, Tim would just go off to the side and be totally by himself and didn't seem to be able to engage with anybody else. And Tim had a lot of difficulty at home sleeping, and he was having a lot of trouble with his siblings. And people would say to me, well, when was the first time you realized, Tim might have had something like schizophrenia? And I say, well, it's kind of the same thing as any chronic condition. When's the first time you notice somebody's got cancer? When's the first time you notice you're beginning to develop heart disease? Well, we don't know. We can't fix it in time. But there's usually a time when a switch flips a little bit and we know there's something a little different. So I write in the book, the first time I knew for sure there was something really different about my son was when he was 6 years old. One day he went out into the middle of the street, lay down in the middle of the street just to see if a car would run him over. That was a little unusual, even for a 6-year-old. But you want to know something? With all that the teachers had noticed, with all of what we were seeing, with all of what we talked to our doctor about, it took us 3 years to get Tim into special education after that. 3 full years that were wasted before we began to adapt his educational plan so that Tim could remain in school. You know, this was some time ago, a couple of decades ago, but today, in many school districts, you need to be at least 2 years behind grade level before they will provide the kind of supports that you need in special education to bring you, they figure, back up to speed. Well, if your child's got serious mental illness and you let them get 2 years behind grade level before you begin to provide any remedial or supportive services, they are never going to finish school. They are never going to graduate. And that's what happened to my son, Tim. By the time we began to get an educational plan in place, we then ended up having, it was 3 years later, first of all, and we began to have to fight in order to get the services that were guaranteed in that educational plan made available to Tim. Well, by the time Tim got into 6th grade, he had already had a psychotic break. He had already been diagnosed with serious mental illnesses. He still did not have, in 6th grade, 2 months into that school year, a plan of support for him that would allow him to succeed in school. So I was fighting with the school principal at that point to try to get that plan in place. And what did Tim do one day? He walked into school, and I opened the book with this anecdote. He brought a gun to school. And now a lot of people hearing that think, okay, that's a really dangerous thing to do. He brought a gun to school, and we all know people with serious mental illness are often a danger to themselves or others. Well, first of all, you know, that's a myth. They are not often a danger to themselves or others. In fact, it's a myth that's been created by policymakers who have wanted to wait to what I call stage 4 in the disease process, post-crisis, before they do anything. So we've adopted this standard that's not a clinical standard and never has been. We're not going to do anything until somebody's a danger to themselves or others. And then we will throw generally the weight of the law at them, not even the health care services they need. Once said to a friend of mine who was involved in writing the regulations for what is now the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's the special education law, as we know it. And I said to him once, Peter, he knew Tim as a teenager, is this who you were thinking about when you wrote those special education laws? He looked at me and he said, Paul, we were thinking of kids in wheelchairs. We had no idea who those kids were, remember, as policymakers, that we were going to be dealing with in those days. Well, do we have a better idea today who they are? Yeah, there's actually a lot of data about kids with serious mental illnesses right now. But you want to know the sad and really tragic truth of this? That is that today, 1 child in every 28 who has a serious mental illness is receiving special education services in our schools as a result of that serious mental illness. 27 out of every 28 children who have serious mental illnesses already present are receiving no special education services to provide supports, accommodations, or modifications related to that serious mental illness. Is it any wonder our kids end up being suspended and expelled from school? That's what happened to Tim when he brought his gun into school. But there's an interesting thing I go into in some detail in the book. And that is that when Tim was suspended from school for bringing a gun at the first time, they actually were not allowed to do so, because we had written into his individualized education program from the year before that Tim could not be suspended from school for any reason at all. And that included that. And so what the school district was obligated to do was to have what they called the manifestation meeting to determine whether or not Tim's behavior was as a manifestation of serious mental illnesses that had been documented thoroughly over the course of the last 5 years. And they determined at that hearing that yes, that was a behavioral manifestation. And so they agreed to change his individualized education program. And they made one change and one change only. And that was to give them permission the next time he brought weapons or drugs into school to suspend him. Now, believe it or not, the very next day Tim went to school, he brought drugs into school with him. How'd that happen? Well, not the way you might think. As I explained in the book, we would have gone off to the dentist's office. And, you know, there was my ex-wife and me, and we had 4 children. And so we took when we went every 6 months for our checkups and our cleanings, we took the last 3 hours of appointments in the afternoon. And that meant that we could all get our teeth done, and the dentist was a really good guy and would let the children kind of have the run of the office during that time. Well, Tim had, I know you're laughing here because you see what's coming. You know what, and I know, it's like, it's what's coming. And so Tim just went around that office, and Tim had an aide at that point. They'd finally put an aide into the classroom who, to reward Tim whenever he did something good, would bring in little vials of cologne. And she'd dab a little cologne on his wrist because he loved the smell of cologne. So Tim in the dentist's office saw what appeared to be to him vials of cologne sitting up on a shelf somewhere. And so he did something he should not have done. He helped himself to those vials of cologne, put them in his backpack, and didn't tell us about it, and then brought them into school the next day so that he could share one of those vials of Novocaine with his aide. And so when the aide saw this, she reported him to the principal. Principal said, aha, controlled substance, I'm calling the police. And so the police were called for what was an episode that really should not have been dealt with in the way that it was dealt with, but Tim was already becoming a behavioral problem for the school who would not follow the rules, and Tim was at that time suspended from school. Why was that such an important date in Tim's life? Because that was the last time Tim ever finished a year of school on time. Starting from 6th grade, Tim continued to go to school all the way to the time he was 18. But from the time of 6th grade and his first suspension to the time of 18, and when he finally left school, when he turned 18, despite the fact he'd gone through 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, despite the fact he'd gone through 35 months of high school, plenty of time to earn a high school diploma, Tim had never been able to stay in a single school for an entire year. And therefore, when he left school, he was technically a high school sophomore, but his math skills and his spelling skills were no better than they were when he had been in the 2nd grade. You think our educational system didn't fail Tim? It didn't fail to do the very basics of education that needed to be provided, but it was worse because it hadn't failed to prepare Tim for adulthood either. In fact, way back when, in the 6th grade, after we'd had all of those diagnoses, and we were actually at what was called a due process hearing, which is a formal hearing that many parents have been through in situations like ours. We were going through that hearing, and under oath, we're all with lawyers, there's a hearing officer, we're all under oath trying to negotiate with the schools and come up with a plan for Tim. With all of that documentation that filled the volume at least that thick, which I still have, the special education teacher under oath, when asked what he thought Tim's most serious issue was, and what his most serious concern was that was affecting Tim educationally, he responded under oath, overprotective parents. Nobody would say that about parents who were concerned about their kid with cancer. Nobody would say that about parents who were concerned about their child with intellectual disabilities. No one would say that about parents who were concerned about a child with physical disabilities who was getting no additional services from this school because they were refusing to provide them. But just as people like Tim go through life being blamed for an illness they cannot avoid, parents of people like Tim go through lives frequently being blamed for the behaviors of those children that are related to illnesses that neither the parents nor the children have any control over. And when those kids turn 18, they don't suddenly flip off the switch and no longer have loving parents who care about them, but they do flip off certain other switches because Tim, at the age of 18, wanted a job. He was hired into a job and fired into a job when the symptoms of his schizophrenia worsened. We would not have done that if Tim had had cancer. When Tim wanted housing, independent housing at the age of 18 because he was an adult, 3 times we got Tim independent housing. 3 times he was evicted from that housing, even when it was supported by the local mental health authority that was providing safety net services because Tim didn't and couldn't follow the rules. So as a result of that, no job, no housing, Tim began to simply drift into homelessness. And just as people in my day and age, we talked about, used to be in what was called a revolving door of deinstitutionalization, whenever we sent them out of the state psychiatric hospitals, they would just, through the revolving door, come right back in. Tim himself got trapped in a different revolving door. It's the revolving door that exists today as a matter of public policy. And that's a revolving door that traps many people like Tim into a cycle of homelessness, occasional hospitalization, and frequent incarceration. And that has been Tim's revolving door for most of the last 10 years. Now, if you asked Tim, is he content with his life? Tim would probably tell you yes. If you asked him, is there anything you can do for him? Tim would probably tell you no. So many people interpret that to mean that Tim is homeless by choice, and that Tim is homeless as a result of choices he's made. Now, I would say, yes, Tim is homeless by choice, but he's not homeless as a result of choices that Tim has made. Tim is homeless as a result of choices that we made as policymakers in the 1980s, when we built this system that now serves my son. When we failed to build an adequate system of services for kids at the earliest stages of the disease process. When we failed to do all we could do to keep kids in school, to keep them well, to move them to recovery, and so that they could graduate and live productive and independent lives. When we built a system that said we are going to remove these children from school initially, and then as they become adults, we're going to continually remove them from society by sending them to jail, not for real manifestations of behaviors that would require that they go to jail, but for manifestations of mental illnesses that have them do certain things, like break probation, which is the most frequent reason Tim goes back to jail, is because he's picked up and he's broken probation because he can't follow up because nobody's provided the services and supports for him to follow up with his probation officer. That's a decision we make, that we're going to send him back to jail at that time. So we've made a lot of the decisions that bring him to where he is and bring people like Tim to where they are. And all I can say about them is that they've got the patience of saints to be willing to put up with a system like this, to be willing to live within a system like this, and to be willing to survive and to thrive as best they can out on the streets of cities like San Francisco with little support, with little assistance, but still nevertheless making it from day to day without any of what we would expect, not just for comforts but for necessities, without any of that, and patiently await for days to become better and have their own sense of hope that tomorrow will be another and a better day. Now, toward the end of the book, I'll go back to some of the public policy issues. We just haven't gotten any better than we were back in the 1980s. The sad fact is that policymakers today compound every mistake that we made in the 1980s, and they worsen a whole lot of them. For example, over the course of the last 5 years, state policymakers alone have sucked $4.6 billion out of mental health systems across the 50 states. $4.6 billion between 2009 and 2013. How much money does that represent? Well, the entire federal budget in SAMHSA, which is related to, which provides the federal support for community mental health services for the entire nation, is $1.2 billion. This is fractions of pennies against our national budget. The entire federal budget is 1/4 of the amount of money the states have cut in the last 5 years alone. Is it any wonder more people like Tim are ending up on our streets, and more people like Tim will continue to end up on our streets? Is it any wonder that we're losing so many young people and now older people to suicide? Is it any wonder that we have abbreviated life expectancy for people with serious mental illness by 25 years? Is it any wonder that they have conditions more frequently like diabetes and heart disease and cancer and all kinds of other physical conditions either, considering the kinds of lives they are forced to lead? Is it any wonder that we have gotten to the place we've gotten when these are the choices we've made? Well, we may have been naive in the 1980s, and maybe that could be my excuse as a policymaker in those days, but that is not an excuse for inaction today. Because while we may not have known how things were going to turn out when we did what we did in the 1980s, we now know today that if we don't do something, this is, in fact, how things are going to turn out. So I want to thank you for your attention tonight. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank those of you who we are getting the book for reading the book, and I want to take any questions or comments you may have at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you.